they find that their endothelial function goes way up when they've had phlebotomy, when they lower their ferritin levels.
Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor. We're supported by the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity, which advocates a simple CT scan to reveal your CAC score. So, know your score and take action to prevent that premature heart attack. Everything you need to know will be right here. I'm here today with Dennis Mangan, more commonly known as PD Mangan, out on Twitter and everywhere else, who's written a book which I read and I was fascinated by, and it's called Dumping Iron. And it's all about the importance of your iron status in the body. So I'd already researched iron because I had a high iron problem many, many years ago when I started researching disease. And then I got dumping iron and it gave all the answers. So hey, Dennis, first time we've talked face to face. Delighted to be here and talk to you.
Thanks, Ivor. I'm delighted to be here too. I'm a big fan of yours. I think the work you're doing with raising awareness of the real causes of heart disease is incredible. I'm a big fan of that. I love it.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dennis. But to be honest, we've riffed a lot out on Twitter and elsewhere and had some great fun. I read your book and it was just fascinating to me because just briefly, I had very elevated ferritin around 530 and high gamma glutamyl transferase 6-7 years ago. The doctors couldn't give any guidance and I started researching and I found out, wow, ferritin and everything to do with iron balance in the body is huge. And then it was afterwards I got your book and it was just unbelievable going through it because I had loads of papers on elevated ferritin and metabolic syndrome and I thought I had most of them you should have. And then I read your book and I said, wow, everything is in here. So maybe we'll start off talking a bit about this for the kind of layperson, just going through all the stuff around iron in the body, the measurements of iron, the pathological significance of iron, and just go through kind of all of it.
Okay, so iron is a required nutrient. We all need it to live, and virtually every living organism needs iron and uses it as part of the biological system. So we must have it. And historically speaking, or in evolutionary terms, I should say, we've lived in an iron scarce environment. So we have human beings have developed a way to grab as much iron as we can out of the environment, which is our food, and to hold on to it. But because of the scarcity of iron in our environment, we have no regulated way of getting rid of iron. So in theory, we are able to absorb iron from our food and regulate it by increasing or decreasing the absorption of iron. But once you got it in you, it's very difficult to get rid of. So women, due to the menstrual cycle, have much lower iron levels on average than men. So what happens is that by about the age of 18 to 20, when both sexes have reached the age of maturity, the iron levels in men start to rise until by middle age, men typically have 4 to 5 times the level of iron in their blood as women do, and they also have 4 to 5 times the risk of heart attacks and of cardiovascular disease than women do at that age. So this fact led the late Dr. Jerome Sullivan to wonder whether, iron could be playing a role here. Until that time, it was thought that the difference in disease rates in heart disease rates in middle-aged men versus women was due to estrogen or other hormones, perhaps. And Dr. Sullivan came up with this idea, this hypothesis, that it was in reality the higher iron levels of men that was causing the higher heart disease rates. And he worked on this idea for the rest of his life, publishing many, many papers. So iron is measured as the protein ferritin. So ferritin is a protein that human beings and other organisms have that controls iron, because iron is a very reactive metal. So you don't want it running around loose inside your body, because it reacts with all kinds of other molecules that are in the body, oxidizes them, and in general is really bad news. So you have this protein ferritin that holds iron within its core and keeps iron safe, so to speak. So ferritin is a measure of stored iron. And if you get a ferritin test, which is a relatively common lab test done in all clinical laboratories, you can tell how much body iron you have. Now, iron, let's see, I'm not sure which way I should go in this story. So iron is implicated in all kinds of other diseases. It's since been found. For example, brain disorders like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. Iron is implicated in both of those. It's been implicated in cancer, in heart disease, like I mentioned, in diabetes. So basically a wide swath of chronic diseases, iron is implicated in all of them. So by implicated, I mean it's strongly suspected that they're playing a role. How definitive that role is, how strong a role is, this is all continuing to be investigated and researched. Now, ferritin, getting back to the ferritin test, there are normal ranges for ferritin, just like there are for any laboratory test. And normal ranges for any laboratory test are done by finding out in which range 95% of the normally healthy population falls. So when you look at ferritin, you find that there's a range of something like 30 nanograms per deciliter, all the way up to, depending on which laboratory you ask, 300, 400, even 500 nanograms per deciliter, excuse me. So the problem is that this normally healthy population, this so-called healthy population, is in reality is subject to lots of chronic disease. They have a high risk of chronic disease, as we know. Many middle-aged people and up have chronic diseases. By the time people are 70, it's something like 90% of the population in the United States has some chronic disease or other. So these normal ranges of ferritin are not accurate, in the sense that if somebody had, let's say, a 250 ferritin level, this shows up as normal on a laboratory test, and a doctor would very likely say nothing about it. He would think that's normal, that's fine, you're good to go. However, there's good evidence that a ferritin level anywhere above 100 is associated with health problems. So this work has been done by, much of this has been done by Dr. Leo Zakarsky, who's at Dartmouth University, who's a brilliant researcher who's done a lot of this work on iron. And one of his most recent papers is to the effect that they figured out that a normal range for ferritin shouldn't be any higher than 100 for optimal health. So people have these ferritin levels, let's say between 100 and 500. At the Mayo Clinic, I believe, their normal range goes up to 500 ferritin level for men. So people have these normal ferritin levels. They may have some kind of problem, health problem that nobody can figure out, but nobody's looking at the iron at the ferritin level because it looks normal. Now, a ferritin level much higher than 500 may get looked at. Although, I talked to someone just recently who had a ferritin level of 700, I believe it was, and he could not get any doctor to take him seriously, to do anything about it. They just said, don't worry about it, it's not a problem. So even a level that high, which is frankly abnormal, doctors may not care much about. Hemochromatosis is a genetic condition that when people have this, they absorb iron much more readily than others, and they can get very high ferritin levels into the thousands. Doctors will take that seriously. And hemochromatosis is associated with an early death, liver disease, all kinds of other things. This is what the very high iron does. So the treatment for that, for hemochromatosis, for a very high ferritin level, is therapeutic phlebotomy. Therapeutic phlebotomy is essentially the same thing as blood donation, only the blood doesn't go to a donor, it is discarded. And also in therapeutic phlebotomy, blood can be removed much more often than for blood donation. So a healthy blood donor can give blood at a blood bank a maximum of 6 times a year. And whereas in hemochromatosis, depending on the patient, it's up to the doctor to decide this, but they can have a phlebotomy as often as once a week. So that's how they get the ferritin levels lower. If somebody has a phlebotomy once a week and they have high iron levels, they will make up those red blood cells very quickly. Iron is a limiting factor there, whereas a healthy blood donor may take several weeks to replace the red blood cells that are gone. So there's an interesting. Dr. Zakarsky had an interesting graph where he plotted average ferritin levels for men and women in the United States, and the ferritin levels, average ferritin levels, reached a peak at about the age of 65 for men, and then they declined down quite a bit to up to the age of 90. Like I think the level at the age of 90 was about half. So so half of the peak. So what is the explanation there? Well, the explanation seems to be that the people with high ferritin levels are dying, leaving the lower ferritin level people to make up the average. So that's the explanation for this declining ferritin level. The Copenhagen City Heart Study looked at ferritin levels and mortality rates, and they found a very high mortality rate with people who had ferritin levels, I believe it was above 600, and decreasing mortality levels at lower ferritin levels, although they didn't look at I think the cutoff was less than 200 or more than 200. If they had looked at less than 100, I feel pretty sure they would have found an even lower mortality rate than those at 200. But it was a linear relationship between ferritin levels and mortality rates. What else would you like to know?
Well, no, I'll just, that's a great summary of the kind of the high level view of ferritin. And when I got my 530, I didn't have a clue what it meant, even though as a biochemical engineer, I'd never got into ferritin as such. The doctor was a little concerned, and because a lot of people in Ireland relatively have hemochromatosis, I think we're like 2% of the population instead of 0.5, I got the genetic
Very
test.
high.
Yeah. So I got the genetic test for it, I also was high in GGT, the liver enzyme, which I later found out was a huge marker for metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. And I began to research it, and I actually started with ferritin, and I could not believe in the first 2 nights exactly what you say, Dennis. The linkages to mortality made LDL as a risk factor look like a joke. I mean, it was stunning, and the same with GGT. But there was a study, and you mentioned below 100, and I agree entirely. There was one study that I found that showed carotid atherosclerosis, right? That was examined in men and women. And basically, below 50, the rates of carotid atherosclerosis were really low. And above 50, just that split, they were way higher, like 6, 7 times higher. But the interesting thing was that the women who were above 50, like and pretty high, they had the same carotid atherosclerosis at middle age as men. In other words, when the ferritin was high, the women no longer had the protective effect. And there are so many other studies that show pretty much exactly what you're saying.
So yes, that study was great. Very striking study of the difference in carotid atherosclerosis between low and high ferritin. There's a great graph with that study that's just kind of blows you away when you see it.
Yeah, well, I guess for sure, Dennis. But the other thing is there are so many studies, many of them similarly striking. Now, a lot of them are associational. They don't prove direct causality. But I mean, just another one I got in the first week or two was LDL is a risk factor against ferritin. And the high LDL versus low LDL people, big differences. But when people were low ferritin, high versus low LDL made no difference. But as the ferritin was higher in the groups, the higher LDL made more and more difference. And I was already beginning to research cholesterol then and realizing that LDL is not an independent risk factor, really. It depends on whether you have inflammation or another problem that's an arterial insult. So it's dependent. But this graph showed it beautifully, higher and higher ferritin indicating more and more potential inflammation, and the LDL began to be a factor. But there are so many of these studies, and yet the world's interest in ferritin, even though it's a more powerful risk marker than LDL, there is no interest.
It's true. There's no interest. There's some researchers out there looking at it, but it's very much under the radar. Very little interest. I feel that the emphasis on cholesterol since going back decades has just put the blinders on the people in this field, the researchers, and they're not seeing this. There's a very striking trial done by the man I mentioned a while ago, Dr. Leo Zakarsky. This was a trial of bloodletting, of therapeutic phlebotomy, and these were men in the Veterans Affairs, Veterans Administration, right? So they were going to the Veterans Administration for their health care. So these are older men, many of them cigarette smokers, and they all had peripheral arterial disease. So this is what it sounds like. Arterial atherosclerosis, but not in the heart. So elsewhere in the body, often in the legs. So they did a trial of bloodletting, and they randomized these men. They were, I'm trying to think, I think they were all men, but they might not have been. Anyway, they were very much, the vast majority were men, at least. And they did a trial of phlebotomy, and their results were somewhat underwhelming in the area of heart disease. But when they analyzed the data, they found out that these men that got phlebotomies and lowered their ferritins had much lower rates of cancer than the men who had not. And even on a further analysis of the data, it's a very difficult sort of study to carry out, because the subjects have to be highly compliant. They have to come in for their phlebotomies and so on, and not all of them did that regularly. And they have to calibrate the phlebotomies to figure out, depending on the hematocrit and hemoglobin of the subjects, how much ferritin they're carrying, and so on and so forth, other factors. They have to calibrate the phlebotomies. But in any case, they found that in both groups, whether the men had phlebotomies or not, the ones that had a ferritin level of about 75 had far lower cancer rates. It was cancer mortality. They had far lower cancer mortality than men in either group who had a ferritin of about an average of 125. So yes, very striking. This study, they looked at these men for several years, and this is something that again, nobody knows about this. So yes, very striking. So another, this is not a randomized controlled trial, but an experiment, I guess, for lack of any other word, of doing phlebotomy on normal people, and they find that their endothelial function goes way up when they've had phlebotomy, when they lower their ferritin levels. And they found this in blood donors, frequent blood donors who give blood several times a year. They compared them to infrequent blood donors who give blood at most once a year. So there's, as I discussed in my book, there's a problem here in looking at blood donors in regards to health. So many studies have found that blood donors have much better health, lower rates of heart disease, and so on, than non-blood donors. The problem is that blood donors are likely to be healthier to begin with. Otherwise, they would not be giving blood. So just analyzing blood donors against the general population may not tell you a whole lot. So what a number of other researchers have done is compare frequent blood donors to infrequent blood donors. So one study that I know of, the frequent donors had given blood several times a year for each of the past 3 years, I believe it was, and then the infrequent donors had only given blood at least once in those 3 years. And they found out that the frequent donors had better endothelial function. So what that means for arterial health, it has a significant meaning for arterial health. It means that arteries function much better, less likely to get atherosclerosis. And as someone said, you're only as old as your arteries. So this is very important. Other studies have shown that lowering ferritin levels by phlebotomy. So let me back up a little bit. The study I was just talking about was an associational study, but other studies have shown when you actually take people and take some blood out of them, do phlebotomy on them, then their endothelial function does increase quite a bit.
Right, and that's direct kind of RCT type or randomized experiment to prove the point, to prove causality. I did see one, and I'll have to pull it out now for show notes, but a very striking graph, and I think it was also peripheral arterial disease, but when they segmented, from memory, it's a few years ago, to older people within the group, the younger people not so much signal, which kind of makes sense because younger people, it'll be harder to see a signal for any deleterious effects. Older people see it easier. And they had a graph of events for peripheral arterial disease, events, and that was recorded, I think, as any, thrombus or operation or problem. And there was a 66% reduction in the people who did, I think it was 2 blood donations or more a year, and it was randomized, versus the people who didn't. Now, technically, it was randomized. You could argue that the people who had the blood taken, well, it could have reduced their oxidized lipoproteins, or it could have had some other effect. But to be quite honest, by Occam's razor, a couple of pints of blood taken won't really impact platelets and lipoproteins so much, but it will impact iron quite significantly. And that's what they were testing. And it's the only RCT I know that was properly executed. And it's kind of interesting that, as such, it showed a much bigger reduction in events for vascular issues than a lot of the mass market medications. But I guess, as we said earlier, there's not a huge amount of interest because I guess there's no real profit motive. There's no real research budget looking for new treatments that's going to be looking at bloodletting. For God's sake, it sounds like medieval stuff.
It certainly does. Therapeutic phlebotomies it's a very inexpensive therapy. I read somewhere where the average doctor bills for $130 for a therapeutic phlebotomy. So it's just as medical care goes, this is dirt cheap.
It just occurs to me, and I often say it to people, that there's mechanistic science behind this. I mean, we can talk in a minute without going too deep. I went through masses of papers 6 years ago. There's fantastic mechanistic evidence for it. There's really strong associational, but we know, as you described, it can be confounded. And then there's some experimental. So all three pillars of evidence are represented for this. But I always say to people, well, even if it's not completely a really big beneficial effect if you're high ferritin to give blood, giving blood also helps people. So it's like a win-win. So whatever about paying, you can give blood in Ireland 3 times a year or 4 times, and I think in the States maybe 6. So you can help other people and highly likely improve your own health with the one intervention. I mean, what's not to like?
Absolutely. The thing is that a large number of people are ineligible to donate blood. So I don't know what the figures are. That they say that the Red Cross has a figure like only 5% of people donate blood, and I'm not sure if that's compared to everyone or only 5% of the eligible people. But nevertheless, there's some. I believe over half of the adult population is ineligible for one reason or another to give blood. You have to be a healthy person, and they have a lot of hurdles to jump.
Just a quick break to remind you that this podcast is only possible due to funding from David Bobbitt and the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity. For middle-aged people, it is imperative to find out your heart attack risk by getting a CT scan of the heart and your CAC score. The new IHDA.ie website has all the scan resources. Please support us by visiting and sharing widely. Knowing your score, you can take action to stop the disease process and save your own life. It can even be as simple as removing sugar, refined carbs and seed oils, i.e. processed food, from your diet. And now we return to the conversation.
So therapeutic phlebotomy would be a nice option. I've had a lot of people ask me, well, how do I get a therapeutic phlebotomy? I just want to get rid of some blood, and I'm ineligible to donate. And we're talking about, say, a normal middle-aged man or woman. I just want to get rid of some blood, but I can't donate. Or, people are too busy. They would love to be able to pop into the doctor's office and get rid of a pint of blood, whereas the blood donation process is a little lengthier. But unfortunately, there are just no good options. The number of doctors who are willing to perform it for an otherwise healthy person with a ferritin level that is not just sky high is very, very few.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I often made the joke with people about, well, Google it and find out how to find a vein. You know,
Okay.
we are not recommending that here. That was a joke. Or find your local drug dealer might be able to help you out with with finding one. But yeah, it's a pity. But in fairness, if it's not acknowledged in the established medical canon or medical science, you could understand the reluctance to do what to a doctor would appear to be quackery, having not looked or seen any of the science. So it's fair enough. But I, interestingly, on another angle on the iron, when I researched it for a few weeks, like I said, I was quite frankly shocked because I saw all the correlations, mortality, cardiovascular disease. I could not believe how problematic high ferritin was in associational data, and the mechanisms were beautiful. I mean, I just buried myself in them. But I found one night, I predicted, because in engineering, you always try and predict, make a hypothesis that can be tested. You know, if you're a root cause specialist like I was, you always try and make the best hypothesis and you try and test it. And when you actually test it and it works, it's like whoopee. But I was looking for papers on metabolic and insulin resistance syndrome. And I knew from my research on iron and ferritin and from my research on hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, I knew that iron and ferritin should link to the insulin resistance syndrome. It kind of had to from the way my research was going because I was following certain paths and I could see where they should intersect. And funnily, one night, it was a Tuesday night, I remember, and my wife was thinking, Ivor's gone crazy. Like every night he comes home from work and he's in there looking at these papers, mountains of papers printed out. And then I found it. And it was basically a Chinese study. And it said, the title practically said that elevated ferritin should be the sixth marker for metabolic syndrome. And I went running out of the room. Yes, I knew it. And the
Yes.
quartiles of ferritin against metabolic syndrome components were just stunning. So I guess the point though that then arose was ferritin can be causal in excess through many mechanisms, but also ferritin elevates in inflammatory conditions like metabolic syndrome, and even people with lupus or arthritis can have really high ferritin. So this whole iron interaction is so complex, and it can be an indicator and a reactant to inflammatory pressure. So it can be both a sign and a driver of problems. So maybe we talk a little about that.
Yes, absolutely. There's there's sort of a, when you're talking about elevated ferritin and things like metabolic syndrome or diabetes, there is a chicken or egg problem here. Which came first? What's causing what? What is, on the one hand, what appears to be happening is that when someone has metabolic syndrome, a lot of the system is screwed up, right? So the system that regulates iron absorption is screwed up, and they could absorb more iron. Another thing going on is then when you have this ferritin. So you've read my book and you know I use this metaphor in my book about ferritin. It's like stored dynamite. So if you have a bunch of dynamite in a crate, it's supposed to be safe. There's nothing there, but you don't really want to have a crate of dynamite in your house. Accidents happen. And so with ferritin, what happens is ferritin itself, that's the safe form of iron, but the iron gets out of it. So and then when the iron gets out of it, the atomic iron, and it reacts with all these other molecules in the body, causes oxidative stress. It oxidizes LDL. It oxidizes the cellular proteins and cellular membranes. And that's exactly what you don't want to have happen. In Alzheimer's disease, for example, there appears to be it's not ferritin as such that's causing the problem, but it's free iron in the brain. So for some reason, the body and the brain are unable to keep that iron safely locked away in ferritin, and it goes out into the brain and causes all these problems. And as you know, Alzheimer's disease is often referred to as type 3 diabetes. So there you have a connection where you've got this insulin resistance syndrome in the brain, and then you've got this free iron causing problems. Which came first? Well, that's hard to say. But what appears to happen in metabolic syndrome and diabetes is that high blood sugar, as you know, causes glucose linking to proteins and other molecules in the body and renders them dysfunctional or non-functional. And what appears to be happening is that ferritin itself is subject to this attack by glucose when blood glucose goes very high. So somebody who has a high blood glucose is more likely to have this glycosylated ferritin. The ferritin is then no longer able to hold the iron within it, and it gets out and causing these oxidation reactions. So as you say, it is very complex. There are several things going on here, many things going on here. And it does appear by my reading that elevated ferritin alone can cause these problems. But then on the other hand, metabolic syndrome can lead to elevated ferritin with lots of free iron in the system causing all these problems.
Yeah, so essentially in a way it may be slightly like insulin itself and hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. It's got insulin resistance, the state has causal pathways, myriad causal pathways to actually damage the body. But insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia also act as a really good gauge of another damaging process that it reacts and rises in response to, like infection, smoking. Your insulin resistance rises in response to many insults that in turn cause damage to your vasculature. So similarly, the raised ferritin being high may be bad for many different reasons. Mine actually, I projected that when I switched to a low carb, healthy fats diet, that my metrics would get better. And I expected, because of the metabolic syndrome, that the ferritin would too, and certainly the GGT. What happened in 7 or 8 weeks was the ferritin went from 530 to I think 220. The GGT went from 115 down to, in 8 weeks or 9 weeks, the high 20s. And my cholesterol ratios all dramatically got better. So it was very pleasing to see that every marker I researched went exactly where it ought to go based on switching the diet and fixing the root causes. But there seems to be people with high ferritin who do not have much disease. So I wonder, and I've wondered this for a couple of years, and recently we did calcification scans on 55 sportsmen. And we had all their bloods and all their scan results, and they were 0 up to 3,200. You know, these were famous sporting players from the 90s. And I noticed the ferritin didn't correlate very well, and there were 0 calcification with high ferritins. It was kind of more randomized. The triglyceride to HDL and the ratios correlated well with the calcification as expected, and the HbA1c was pretty good. But I've wondered from small pieces of data over the years, can certain people have a high ferritin and yet it really is sequestered safely and they're managing it without any deleterious effects?
But I think in theory that could be absolutely correct. However, I'll just bring up, well, I want to speak to one thing you said where you had a stack of papers and going through this stuff, and I had exactly the same experience. I mean, it was amazing. You look at this stuff and you think, my God, this is just what is going on here, and nobody knows this. What happened to me was I started looking into this and thinking, this is just incredible. And I wrote several articles on my website for it. And then at some point I said, well, I have to write a book about this because this is just too important just to have a few articles on my website. And so I did, obviously. But back to your question about high ferritin levels and whether or not somebody could have a high ferritin and be healthy otherwise. There was a recent study that looked at people with the genes for hemochromatosis. People with the genes for hemochromatosis can have a wide range of ferritin levels. So not all of them get super high, right? So somebody with hemochromatosis that has the obvious health problems may have a ferritin levels over 1,000, over 2,000, even higher. But other people, for various reasons, may not develop ferritin levels that high, even with the gene, because there's so many factors that go into iron levels. You know, just to name a couple: alcohol consumption. Alcohol increases the rate of iron absorption. Vitamin C, you know, from orange juice increases the rate of iron absorption. Things like that. So depends on what people eat and genetic makeup and other factors. So anyway, there are people with the hemochromatosis genes that have a wide range of ferritin levels, not all of them necessarily super high. And they looked at a lot of people that had these hemochromatosis genes, but were not necessarily diagnosed with hemochromatosis. And they found that these people had much higher risks of various health problems, liver disease, heart disease, and so on, than others in the population. So what does that show? That seems to show that high ferritin levels, even when not as high as to cause hemochromatosis, are damaging, generally speaking. Whether one individual necessarily has health problems if they have a relatively high ferritin, maybe not. But in general, higher ferritin levels are associated with health problems in this population.
Yeah, for sure. And the data is very compelling that in general it's a really bad sign. I mean, even the studies we referred to and I referred to earlier, and I was just piqued, or my curiosity was piqued. Are there exceptions that prove the rule? A bit like, I mean, you can take familial hypercholesterolemia. People who have familial hypercholesterolemia have a genetic susceptibility to damage from the modern environment. That's the way I view it, like ApoE4 people. As some of them who have very high particle numbers go to long, healthy lives with no problem with atherosclerosis, and some burn up really young. Now, I think the environmental influence is huge that interacts with the high particle count. But again, you know, there may be a pocket of high ferritin people where their physiology is running a high ferritin, but manages to keep it safe, like you say, in the ferritin macromolecule, and it's just kept physiologic and it's okay. But to be honest, we're not going to get the data for that. The message today for people is ferritin is a really powerful risk factor with many, many mechanisms. And I'll just mention, actually, years ago, I came across a Chris Kresser video called Iron Behaving Badly. And it was quite a good summary, and Chris is a really smart guy, but it was essentially the same as what we're talking about, broadly speaking. You know, it is something to really watch and watch carefully. And the dimwits who are just looking at their cholesterol and not looking at ferritin and GGT and other key markers, you know, you're kind of missing wood for trees in many cases.
Absolutely. There was another. I'm just remembering here, just something I saw a couple days ago. A study about heterochronic parabiosis, which to those is of great interest to those of us who are interested in the anti-aging field, in aging research. And so heterochronic parabiosis involves exchanging the circulations of two lab animals, usually mice. And this is the so-called, probably most people have heard of this, the young blood rejuvenating idea. Anyway, in this particular experiment, what they found was this was highly related to iron, that the old animals had higher levels of tissue iron, and that being exposed to the young blood from the younger animals lowered their levels of tissue iron. And these particular researchers concluded that iron was a huge factor in this phenomenon of heterochronic parabiosis. This is something, all modesty aside, that I've been saying for a while. Here's another interesting factor about this in heterochronic parabiosis is that old blood appears to be worse for a young animal than the young blood is good for the old animal. So, you think, oh, well, what's going on here? Maybe it's iron. That's the obvious thing that occurs to me. And animals do accumulate iron as they age. There was a good study about that, how it's related to sarcopenia, and that the known anti-aging treatments that we know work, for instance, in lab animals, calorie restriction, giving them much less food. It also means they accumulate much less iron as they age. So iron, there's an iron angle here at everything. I'm not saying that that's the whole story by any means, but it's just an overlooked factor here in not only in disease, but in aging in general.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, you wrote, I'm so busy the past couple of years, I can't keep up with anyone's books, but you've also written a book on anti-aging. So if we twisted away from iron for a moment, any thoughts you have on anti-aging in general? I mean, I have thoughts, and myself and Dr. Gerber wrote essentially a longevity book, Eat Rich, Live Long. But it's all the usual things like the critical vitamins, minerals, the lower carb, no vegetable oils, resistance training, blah, blah, fasting. Everything is in there, including a bit on iron. But your book on longevity, yeah, would you want to pull out some of your top things that you're excited about?
It's like you just said that most of the things that conduce to good health are also anti-aging. So, for example, we know that in lab animals, restricting their food makes them live longer. So, for human beings, fasting is an obvious anti-aging intervention. And what's interesting is the parallels between aging and obesity. So when human beings age, their insulin resistance increases. They tended to get more body fat and lose muscle. And they accumulate iron, obviously. But so many of these, there's so many parallels between obesity and aging. When we age, we're not able to regulate metabolism as well. At least those are the facts. What's causing that? How much of that is due to aging, and how much of that is due to the modern environment, modern lifestyle? That's a good question. These are actually kind of deep questions, because even when you study laboratory animals, you get into I've discussed this on my site quite a bit. Well, if you're feeding them garbage and keeping them in cages, how much, is that really a study of aging? If you feed them less garbage and they live longer, well, that makes sense. But is it really anti-aging, or just feeding them less garbage? In any case, what we can do for anti-aging, the most important things are those things that are the opposite of obesity and insulin resistance. So have a low level of body fat, a high level of muscle, have a high level of insulin sensitivity. In my view, that calls for eating whole, minimally processed foods, preferably lower in carb, but certainly not including refined grains, sugar, and vegetable oils. Those are out. In a nutshell, that's what I think that people should do for anti-aging is body composition and insulin sensitivity are very important.
Yeah, Couldn't agree more. And I love as well, I mean, for the general person who's not going to get into all of the different factors here and the myriad factors, you know, sugar, refined carb, veg oil elimination, and the processed foods that carry those constituents, because ultra processed food is full of vegetable oils and refined carb. Take all that out and just eat real food. Most people, if they start young enough, wouldn't even have to worry too much about counting macros to the last degree. You know, that's the reality. I always loved Dr. Ron Rosedale's phrase, and maybe he took it from somewhere. He said, diabetes is essentially a model of accelerated aging. And
Yeah, yes, very good. Yes, I agree with that.
it's so perfect because all the diseases of modernity, all the chronic diseases that have come in the last century, diabetes accelerates them all. And there was a lovely study by Professor Gerald Reaven, the kind of master of insulin resistance research. And it only had a few hundred middle-aged people, but they were randomly picked, and he split them into tertiles, thirds of insulin sensitivity, with a really accurate steady-state plasma glucose insulin test. So a proper test, not just a fasting insulin. And basically, the bottom third, who were insulin sensitive over 7 years, had zero disease, death, or any problem. The middle third had 12 cases of disease and death out of the whatever 80 number. And the top third of insulin resistance had 28. And it was cancers, diabetes, and all the hypertension, all the usual stuff. And he basically, they said essentially insulin resistance or sensitivity kind of sits at the center of diseases of aging. But still, though, I know I met doctors 6 years ago and I started my research. Good guys. I mean good guys. And they actually were not really familiar with metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance syndrome. And only when they Googled it after I told them, they came back to me and said, oh my God. And they were quite frankly shocked. I told them, just go and Google insulin resistance and any disease that you're seeing in your population in the last 30 years. And they did. And within minutes, their jaws dropped. They had no idea that the literature is absolutely crammed with hundreds of thousands of papers linking insulin sensitivity to all the diseases they're trying to deal with. It's mad.
It is mad. The study that you mentioned by Gerald Reaven and colleagues, one of whom I got to throw this in was one of these colleagues that worked on that was Dr. Francesco Facchini, who wrote a blurb for my book Dumping Iron. He's done a lot of iron research, but in any case, the study by Reaven and colleagues, yes, it's incredible when you see that graph of the people grouped by insulin sensitivity, tertiles of insulin sensitivity, and the diseases. It's one of the most striking things that you can ever see related to health. Insulin sensitivity is just critical for health. It's just, I would have to assume that your experience with the doctors not knowing this is typical. It's sad.
It's very sad because, I mean, in say engineering or high tech industry, that could never happen because businesses can only survive by knowing the real causes and addressing them. Otherwise, their competitor would kill them. But in medicine, though, there isn't that same selection pressure, and you can easily go ahead without knowing root causes, and it technically won't affect your business. So I think it's not a conspiracy. It's just no one's interested if there's no drug for it, I guess. But yeah, the other paper from Reaven, just it actually springs to mind as we speak. Reaven had one, and I nearly can remember the title. It's years ago. He said, all obese people are not created equal. Dash. Insulin resistance is the determinant of cardiovascular risk in the obese. And I mean, he just split them out again, large numbers by insulin sensitivity, and all the cardiometabolic risk factors dramatically went from high down to low as they got more insulin sensitive, and they were all the same big BMI. And you're right, no one knows this, even many doctors.
Right. I like your analogy there with business, because that this couldn't happen in business because, like you say, the competitors would get you. But the same selection pressures are not in medicine, apparently, because it just keeps going on. I think that, yes, this problem of them generally not knowing and wanting to prescribe drugs, there's another chicken or egg problem there too. As I'm sure you know, pharmaceutical companies are very involved um, in influencing medical research and influencing medical practice and influencing the standard of care. But there's also the case where patients are often, reluctant to do anything much about changing. Also, the fact that most doctors really wouldn't know what to tell them to change, rather than prescribing a drug. So there's lots of levels here where people are not getting the help they need, in my view.
Yeah, and that's true, and hopefully things are changing. Though I was chatting earlier, I did a podcast with Dr. Andy Fung, and he's new to this, but he was 8 years a doctor. He's in New York, and he went through college, residency, and 7 or 8 years of practice, and then he became pre-diabetic himself. He's Asian extraction, obviously, and he spent a whole year exercising an hour a day on an elliptical machine, didn't lose any weight, did improve his blood glucose a little. And then he discovered, I think it was Dr. Jason Fung, and it blew him away. But long story short, he's now for the last year massively helping his patients rather than just giving them pills. And he admitted and acknowledged, in fairness, and so would I, which you said, he still has a lot of patients who won't do it, even when he explains it. But a large proportion are doing it, and he's got guys lost nearly 100 pounds, insulin down from 25 down to like 5, like massive VLDL and triglyceride levels collapsed. And he has a huge proportion of his patients who are just absolutely ecstatic because someone actually has told them what they need to do. And they won't all do it, but a huge amount will.
Yes, yes, I'm sure that many people, if they hear it from their doctor, doctor's orders and all that, they'll do it. So, but obviously, right now, not very many people are getting those doctor's orders.
Yeah, well, I think, to be quite honest, the power of the internet 6 or 7 years ago, with PubMed, ResearchGate, and all the data and published papers, allowed me to find out. The same thing allowed you. And there's a growing army of citizen scientists. And the beauty is, doctors are too busy. The guys I mentioned are great guys. They said, like, there's no way they're going to go home at night and start looking up stuff. They've got their CMEs, they've got their education, continued medical education, and that's mostly kind of pharmaceutical based. And there's no way they have time. But by feeding back to the doctors and all these podcasts and all of this worldwide, the conferences on low carb, this massive groundswell, I think it's going to get back in the next few years to more and more doctors, particularly young ones. And I'm expecting a kind of a revolution. Am I too positive about it?
um, no, I don't think so. I see a lot of those same things that you are, and I've seen on Twitter, I've seen doctors actually changing their minds. Um, you might know, I'm sure you know, Dr. Tro, Kalajian, I think is his last name.
Yeah.
And he was obese himself, and he's very much not obese. And he changed his mind. He got on Twitter and he was talking to people, and he decided that he was going to give this low carb a try. And now he's he lost a lot of weight, like 150 pounds or something along those lines, and he's become an evangelist for it. I think that's great. I just saw another one just the other day. A doctor who I couldn't tell you her name at the moment, and I had not heard of her before, but she was basically figuratively slapping herself in the forehead saying, I can't believe medicine as a profession is overlooking all this. It's got to change.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Dennis. Tro is fantastic. I had a massive Twitter fight with Tro a few years ago about LDL, and he was just coming into the low carb thing, I think, but he was still a big LDL believer. And we're great friends now. But Tro is not just converted. He's not just been able to change his mind about everything and lose an enormous amount of weight. He's become a trailblazer, and actually it's himself and Brian Lenskis, I think I met in San Diego, another doc. Those two guys now are doing the Low Carb MD podcast. I mean, it's exactly. But you know something, I know we're both got time or hard stops here. It's late in the evening here in Ireland, and you've got a busy day. But that's quite a positive note to kind of begin to wrap up on. What do you think?
Yes, we can only hope. I'm out trying to spread the word myself. We didn't talk too much until the end here about low carb, but I'm very much in favor of it, and especially getting rid of all the ultra processed foods, eating whole minimally processed food. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the food that people eat is ultra processed food. I think that's pretty much the root cause of our problems, our modern health problems right there. Yes, so hopefully people are becoming more aware of that, and yes, and the doctors will become more aware of that too.
Yeah, and I just thought of another positive note to end on, the calcification scan, and I work on behalf of Irish Heart Disease Awareness, a charity, to get out information about a life-saving scan. CAC score basically tells you if you've got big disease and huge risk and allows you to take action, even if your bloods don't really say much. But in the 2018 guidelines, delighted last year, they've now come out with CAC level 2A evidence to use it for middle risk people, to a paradigm shift to actually use a scan that sees the heart disease directly rather than blood tests in medication decisions. So there may very well be people now finding out their true level of heart disease, maybe not needing medications rather than needlessly getting medications for life, and then finding people who are huge risk who can get medications and every other intervention. So that's another shot in the arm for me this year.
That's fantastic, Ivor.
Yeah, good to go. So we got to keep getting the message out. Listen, Dennis, it was a pleasure to talk to you. And you know what? We're going to be back talking again. And we got to pick a few more topics to kill.
That's great, Ivor. It's totally a pleasure talking to you. I'm a big admirer of yours. I think the work you're doing is fantastic, and I hope you keep on keep on going with it. It was really great talking to you.
And yourself too, Dennis. Hugely enjoyed your book, and I need to get to your others. And you're a big force on Twitter too, and I think I agree. Twitter is where a lot of this is going to really get out.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Dennis.
Okay,
good luck.
Thanks.
Till next time.
Thanks, Ivor. Talk to you later.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my subscribe button in the middle of the screen, a free viewing of the Widowmaker movie on the far right, and myself and Dr. Gerber's book, Eat Rich, Live Long, on the left. Otherwise, please do subscribe to the audio podcast. Thanks.